So now I'd like to introduce this evening's speakers. I'm delighted that we've got two speakers from different parts of a wide family who conducted a tremendous amount of research into the Baker family. First, we're going to hear from Gillian Mueller. Gillian is a retired diplomat, former China trade specialist, born to Anglo-American parents at the American Embassy in Tehran, grew up in Athens, Ankara, and Tel Aviv in the 1960s and 70s, and returned to the US to study philosophy at Vassar College and foreign affairs in Washington, DC. She married a fellow diplomat, and they served in Warsaw, Vilnius, Berlin, Karachi, Kathmandu, and Accra. Thereafter, she took up editing professionally and writing for fun, publishing You Have No Idea in 2011. I think, Gillian, is that another memoir, a family memoir? Is that correct?
It is. It's Al Mueller's, my husband's, it's my mother-in-law. It's her memoir.
No, excellent. Thank you. Discovering her grandparents' 1911 correspondence between Constantinople and Cairo, Gillian went to Istanbul in 2011 to explore the Bakers' history and book ideas. A subsequent trip to the UK surfaced letters, diaries, personal accounts, and photographs. The upshot is not one, but three manuscripts about George Baker's story, that of his son Arthur, who inherited the shop, and a third on Arthur Baker's daughter Elsie, bringing us a woman's perspective. They cover George Baker's arrival in Turkey in 1848 to Arthur Baker's return to England in 1926, and the dissolution of G&A Baker Limited after the First World War. And George Baker, the founder of the dynasty, is Gillian's great-great-grandfather. And Gillian's going to give us the early part of the history around George Baker. The second part of the talk will be by James de Wesselow. Now, I have to confess that I've known James for many, many years, probably decades before we actually realized that we had a Levantine connection, which we discovered last year. But a little bit about James. James de Wesselow's late mother, Jane Baker, had worked briefly for her father in the family's fabric business, G.P. and J. Baker. So these are the sons of George Baker, before she was married and before the business was forcibly sold by administration in the early 1960s. James grew up in the 1960s and 70s in Berkshire, largely unaware that this sad event dominated his maternal grandparents' lives. After a spell working for Shell Agrochemicals, James spent much of his business career running a family-owned horse racing publishing business on his paternal side of his family before it was successfully sold to a national newspaper group in 2000. And for the last 13 years, he ran the digital subscription and books divisions of the London-based Racing Post. He knew little of his late mother's family, the Bakers, until researching their fascinating history via the LHF website and other resources last year. And you know, obviously connected up with Gillian in the process. And he has also prepared a book, short book, The Baker Chronicles. So without more ado, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to hand over to Gillian. We will take questions and comments at the end. To please attract my attention by using the Zoom hand wave, turning your video on and waving at me, using the Zoom chat function, and I will endeavour to keep order. Gillian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Quentin. I'm trying to screen share. Oh, here we go. Is it on?
Yes. Yep.
Terrific. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Quentin. Thank you, Craig. It's a great honor to be here. Greetings, friends, family, Baker fans. It's so wonderful to see you here. When Al and I were in Istanbul last fall, a university student in a bookstore in Beyoğlu said to me, when I told him I was writing a book about George Baker, he said, British merchant, right? I know him. He's on the internet. Whereupon he rushed to his computer to pull up the Levantine Heritage website. Do you know about the website? He said to me excitedly. Yes, I did. In 1949, the British Chamber of Commerce in Istanbul published an article in which it said, quote, "The story of George Baker is one typical of that brand of enterprising Englishmen who, from Elizabethan times, carried on the spirit of risk and adventure, of pioneering and colonizing the world. It is to men such as he that England owes her greatness." So one reason George deserves a closer look is because he is a hero of the late British Empire. He embodied what made England great. It is to men such as he that England owes his greatness. Another reason is the rags to riches nature of his story. It was uncommon in Britain in the late 19th century, when society was split along rigid class lines, the divisions historically and culturally entrenched, and virtually impossible to transcend. But that's what George did. It makes him a little different, I think, and worth a closer look. So how do you do it? How do you go from London street merchant to gardener to merchant mogul in the Ottoman Empire? He could have stopped at Gardner and had a fine life in England, but he went out to Turkey to be a pioneer and colonizer of the world, as the article said. He was also, in a sense, a Turkophile. He preferred a life in Turkey to one in England. He loved the place and its mix of ethnicities and nationalities. At the time, he blended right in, as you'll see from an upcoming photograph. Today, I'm going to examine George's humble origins, which until recently were unknown. I'll touch on his career in gardening that propelled him to Turkey as the British Embassy gardener. I'll compare his trajectory to that of a few of his siblings, and I'll contrast the London street urchin with the rich, respected Victorian gentleman he turned himself into once he got to Constantinople. I won't be talking about his wife, Maria, sadly. There's not enough time for that, I'm afraid, and I won't be talking about the business so much either, except to give you a quick overview. When the Baker business was at its peak at the onset of World War I, the Istanbul branch was trading in hundreds of commodities worldwide and operating 20+ department stores, specialty shops, wholesale outlets, and warehouses in Istanbul. The Bakers owned or leased at least 11 residences. These included the Baker Enclave at Rumeli Hisar, which George and his son-in-law Charlie Edwards bought and built in the 1880s. As you can see, the three houses are still in use today. By 1914, it also involved Zeki Pasha Yali. George's son, Arthur, was renovating the main Baker winter and summer residences and moved the family to Zeki Pasha Yali for the duration. Then, as now, it is one of the largest properties on the Bosphorus waterfront and the most expensive. Right now, it's on the market for close to £100 million. The point being that for son Arthur in 1914, money was no object. It was a similar situation for George's sons GP and Jim running the London end of the business, which James de Wesselow will be talking about. Between both branches, Istanbul and London, the Baker Company cast a wide net. It was operating in Canada, the US, UK, France, Germany, Spain, Bulgaria, Turkey, Russia, Iran, and owned factories in India that were spitting out carpets on spec. I can't tell you what the business's net worth was in 1914, but it was substantial for its time and its trading was global. So how did George do it? How did he get there? From nothing. The Istanbul Chamber of Commerce article goes on to say that, quote, George Baker came from a large family of yeoman stock, but without the advantage of influence in high places. It's true that George's parents had no influence in high places, but it's erroneous to claim that he came from yeoman stock. Yeomen were domestics, bureaucrats, farmers, working class folks, anyone who served the crown and nobility. At the top, you had the aristocrats, serving them were the yeomen, and below them were the poor. George's parents weren't yeomen so much as paupers. They were of the poorhouse stock. That's what Americans called it, but in Britain it was called the workhouse, and the workhouse was one rung above the jailhouse. The article I quoted was written by one of George's grandsons in the business, Cecil Edwards. He got it wrong because George kept his humble origins a secret from his children, from his descendants, from anyone who cared to know. But thanks to the internet, public records, and my skilled cousin, Stacy Wallace Rabine, who is here today, we've been able to weave together an intriguing story from available facts. When George's mother, Sarah, was about 22 years old, she became pregnant with George's brother, William. Because she was not married, it seems that her father kicked her out of the house and banished her from their village of Wannersh in Surrey. James Virgo, or Grandpa Virgo as I'll call him, was a well-to-do nurseryman. He owned several such garden centers in and around Wannersh. My impression is he was the main business of the town. Grandpa Virgo was a yeoman, but he was not such a nice man. Despite desperate with nowhere to go, Sarah ended up at the Spitalfields workhouse in London's East End. It's one of the better-known poorhouses made famous by American journalist Jack London, who stayed there in 1902 and wrote of his experience. You can see from the pictures that it was a wretched place to be, and would have been much more so a century earlier when Sarah was there. After giving birth to William, Sarah languished at Spitalfields for another 2 years until she was summoned home by her father. There she married Francis in a presumed shotgun wedding. She also relinquished custody of William to her father. Grandpa Virgo unofficially adopted William as his son and had the church records doctored to reflect that William had been born at Wannersh, not Spitalfields, on the right date, but a year earlier. The year is even wrong on William's tombstone. Mind you, Grandpa Virgo already had a son, an illegitimate one, by his housekeeper. Samuel Virgo was 13 years older than William and lived and worked at the Virgo nurseries his whole life. But when Grandpa Virgo died, Samuel got nothing. Grandson William got everything, valued at nearly 8 million pounds in today's money. Not bad for a boy born in the workhouse. George's mother, Sarah, and her sister got a couple pieces of furniture each. That's it. Imagine the yarn Grandpa Virgo must have spun for the village and congregation to explain William's sudden appearance in Wannersh 3 years after Sarah's abrupt disappearance from his home. Grandpa Virgo was no help to Sarah and Francis. On the contrary, he sent them right back to the workhouse. After they married, he must have fired Francis from the nursery and banished them from Wannersh again. Because 9 months later, they were back at the workhouse, a different one this time, attached to St. George's Church at Hanover Square. There, Sarah gave birth to George's sister, Elizabeth Catherine, who went by the name of Catherine. Between Catherine and their next child, Sarah, Francis and Mother Sarah managed to escape the system. We suspect they had help from Francis's family, since none would have come from Grandpa Virgo. The workhouse was an easy place to end up in, but difficult place to escape. It's where poor people went when they lost their jobs or were injured and couldn't work or were too old to make a living. It's where they went to die. If anything had happened to Francis, the family would have gone straight to the workhouse, the children separated from their parents and maybe adopted out. It's where Francis and Sarah would have gone in their old age, had it not been for George and 2 of his brothers, James and Frank, who had the means to support them in their old age. Contributing to the workhouse mystique was the attitude in British society that indigents needed to be separated and shunned from society, that they were to blame for their condition and deserved to be punished. God is good, and you merit what's coming to you in the workhouse. A lot of shame was wrapped up in any connection with the place, which is probably why George never said anything to his children. Sons Arthur and George Percival, who was called GP to distinguish him from his father, began their accounts noting how surprised they were. They knew almost nothing about their grandparents. GP thought his grandfather's origins must have been, quote, unpretentious. He remembered that Francis had worked in a nursery. Arthur had no idea. George had left them all in the dark. For George growing up, therefore, his family was permanently parked on the lowest rung of British society, and they were always just one step ahead of falling back into the workhouse. George approached his 10th birthday, the age when boys of his class were expected to start paying their own way. He easily could have slid back into the system and nearly did. The threat of it hung over his head, and I believe it informed the two big decisions he made early on. The first was to run away from home at the age of 12. The second was to run away from England at the age of 25 to try his luck in the radically alien metropolis of Constantinople, capital of the great Ottoman Empire. I propose that he made these decisions in order to put as much distance as he possibly could between himself and his humble origins. I believe that's the reason he and Maria are buried in Turkey when most of their children, who were born and raised in Turkey, returned to England to die. When George left England in 1848, he had no desire or intention of going back. George was born in 1822 in a small cottage on the village green of Totteridge, North London. Once the bucolic countryside of Hertfordshire, it has since been absorbed into London's suburban sprawl. On one side of the green is St. Andrew's Church, where Sarah and Francis are buried. On the other was and is the village pub, where Father Francis may have spent a few shillings over a few pints. Francis was a garden laborer. This means he could have worked on a farm or a nobleman's estate or at a nursery like the Virgos. The point being, he was a laborer first and had little to no professional training. It also means that his meager wages had to feed and house a family of 12, and that meant that the children, around the time of their 10th birthday, were expected and encouraged to move on. He had 9 siblings, including his illegitimate brother, William. 5 did pretty well for themselves, whereas the other 5 struggled like their parents. At the outset, though, George was not as lucky as his older siblings. They got a better start than he did. I've told you about William Virgo. Here they are again. They've been mistaken for each other, but notice that William is fair and George is dark. Their eyes are different. They look alike as brothers can, but they are not the same person. Catherine married John Wallace, a market gardener from Scotland. We'll come back to the Wallaces in a minute. When George's brother Frank was about 10 years old, he left home to apprentice in a tailor shop, and in time, he had his own tailor business. We'll see evidence of his handiwork coming up. Brother James apprenticed with a linen manufacturing company of Morley Powell in Britain. Starting out as an errand boy, he rose to become a principal partner. This was due to his later partnership with George. When George got the baker business underway in Turkey, James continued at the linen factory, but opened a separate office where he operated as George's procurement officer and shipping agent. When James died, George's eldest son, GP, took it over. It went on to be called GP and J Baker, the J standing for younger brother, Jim. This was the London end of the business that James de Wesselow will be telling you about. George didn't get an apprenticeship like his brothers, and he didn't marry up like his sister, Catherine. He was forced into the gardening industry by his father. When he was about 10, Francis started taking him to work. George's education suffered as a consequence. Whereas James and Frank continued their studies during their internships, George was pulled out of school to work in the fields, gardens, or nurseries as dictated by the season and as dictated by his father. Any earnings George received would have been pocketed by his father as well. The good news is George took easily to the profession and was good at it. His timing was also impeccable because the British gardening industry was just reaching its zenith. The Victorian era is noted for its extraordinary innovations in the study and cultivation of plants. There was such an explosion of interest that gardening became a national obsession. George's timing and career, though chosen for him by his father, couldn't have been more providential. However, 2 years into working for his father, George couldn't take it anymore and ran away from home. Whatever precipitated it, the act was spontaneous. He was 12. He took with him only the clothes on his back and a shilling in his pocket. I can't tell you where this shilling came from, but likely not his father, Francis. Maybe it was Sarah, who had a secret stash for emergencies, just such as this one. Mind you, for George, to go homeless was a dangerous proposition. It shows just how bad his troubles must have been with his father. To George, escaping the situation at home was worth the risk of getting picked up on the street and thrown into the workhouse. The odds were pretty good, but George was willing to take the chance. George never spent his shilling. Because of what happened next, he decided it brought him good luck and later attached it to his watch chain, where it forever hung in his pocket. I suspect it probably went to the grave with him too. We know George walked for about 4 hours or 14 miles because just a few days ago, Al and I determined that he ended up at Chesson, east-northeast of Totteridge. As darkness fell, he took shelter in a greenhouse by the side of the road and spent the night there. He was discovered the next morning by William George Middleton, who was a nurseryman like Grandpa Virgo. He owned or leased property at or near Bury Green, near Chesham, where he grew plants to sell. Middleton, we discovered, had 2 sons. They had died of cholera and their names were William and George. We thus have an inkling of why Middleton took George in. But more so than that, Middleton took George under his wing. It's not clear how long George stayed with him, a couple months, a couple years, but it was under Middleton's stewardship that George began his formal education, mostly in gardening. Middleton gave him gardening books to study at night and quizzed him afterward. This Baker family photo album in the Levantine Heritage website has this picture of a gardening book, Every Man His Own Gardener. I don't know if it's one of the books Middleton gave George, but the title is in keeping with Middleton's mentoring. You reap what you sow, you are what you do, the choices you make are important if you want to succeed. Much more so than Francis, Middleton was a role model and a father figure. He tutored George, brokered jobs for him, and supervised his professional progression, which involved written, oral, and practical exams to rise from laborer to gardener, to journeyman, to foreman, to head gardener, where George plateaued at the remarkable age of 18. Above all else, Middleton opened his eyes to the bigger picture, one full of hope, prospect, and opportunity. George didn't have to be a garden laborer like his father his whole life. Having reached the top of his profession, the next step would have been for George to become a nurseryman like Middleton and Virgo. And so when George boarded the steamship headed for Turkey, we know from his notebook that he was already thinking about establishing a nursery business when he got there. I won't get into the rest of George's resume, except to say that Middleton persuaded him to make amends with his father. George worked for Francis for 2 more years, after which he went to work for his brother William at the Virgo nurseries. By then, Grandpa Virgo was semi-retired. While there, George was promoted to from gardener to journeyman, a big step. I'd like to think that William helped him prepare for his exams, despite the rift between the 2 families. The bigger question, of course, is whether George and William even knew they were brothers. The last and most important kindness Middleton showed George was to introduce him to Joseph Knight. Knight was proprietor of the Royal Exotic Nursery of London and a founding member of the Royal Horticultural Society. He and his nursery were leading Britain's preoccupation with gardening and botany. His nursery was at the forefront of the industry and the science. Knight was also the go-to guy for gardening recommendations. He was the yeoman with connections in high places. He was a self-made man, which may be why he went out of his way to help George. He was a conduit between the lower and upper echelons of British society, and he decided George was worth promoting. He wrote in a letter to a noblewoman, "My lady, since I was applied to by some ladies last evening for a gardener to go to Constantinople, I am convinced I have made a good choice of a very studious, clever young man in George Baker, one who will rise to the head of his profession. His knowledge in the various branches is first rate. His manners are modest and good, and his industry and trustworthiness cannot be surpassed." Now, before Knight put George's name forward, George's brother-in-law, John Wallis, who was married to his sister Catherine, had already been appointed to the slot, but Catherine was opposed. We don't know her reasons, but she put her foot down. So Wallis withdrew his application, which left the position open for George to fill. The family credits Catherine most of all with getting George to Turkey, although Middleton and Knight clearly had a lot to do with it as well. Catherine's choice was steeped in irony, because while George went off to Turkey and made his millions, the Wallises went off to America and were beset by tragedy. Within a few years, both Catherine and John Wallis were dead, their 5 children cast adrift to uncertain fates. For some months prior to leaving England on April 23, 1848, George trained for his assignment at Kew Gardens. His notebook contains these notes, which he apparently made while he was there. So what was George's assignment in Turkey? When the usual practice was to hire a gardener locally, why was it decided that a Kew-polished master gardener like George should be shipped out from England? What was so important about his assignment to merit the expense? George's first mission was to install new gardens at the main British embassy in Pera. Today, it's the British consulate and known as Pera House. Back then, it was the embassy and called the British Palace. The former building had been destroyed by fire in 1831, and construction of the new one was now underway. George was also to install a fresh set of formal gardens at the British summer residence at Tarapia, today's Tarabya, 10 miles north of the city up the Bosphorus. London and the ambassador were negotiating construction of a sumptuous new villa on the site to go with the extravagant British palace underway in Pera. But think about it. Installing these new gardens was predicated on completion of both buildings first. George couldn't start landscaping at either site until the buildings were up, and the construction site was no longer just that. But here's the rub. George got there in May 1848. And the new British palace didn't open for business until January 1856, almost 8 years later. And construction of the summer residence wasn't started for another decade and a half, by which time George had long since gone into trade. The upshot? When George landed at Tarapia and began his work, he had a lot of free time on his hands, time to contemplate and embark on his nursery business. In deference to Knight, he might have called it something like Baker's Royal Exotic Nursery of Constantinople. It has a nice ring. Just as Middleton and Knight helped George maximize his gardening career in England, so too did 2 more 19th century heavy hitters propel him into trade. They were British Ambassador Sir Stratford Canning, who was ennobled Lord Stratford de Redcliffe in 1852, and Sultan Abdul Mejid I. In this case, George had some help from his brother James at the linen factory in London. Stratford Canning was Britain's envoy to the Ottoman court on and off for 32 years. The entire time George was employed by the embassy, Canning was his boss and running the show. So what sort of support did Canning extend to George, and how did it intersect with his policy objectives at the time? These were to promote and expand British trade in the region, the endgame being to colonize India, her the jewel in the crown. Building the Suez Canal, 1859 to 69, was part of this strategy, thereby connecting the North Atlantic with the Indian Ocean through the Mediterranean and speeding travel time by a couple of weeks. Second, to safeguard free and unimpeded passage through the Bosphorus Strait. That was a priority of Canning's, because without it, trade between England and Eastern Europe and the Middle East was difficult, if not impossible. And beyond that, among other things, Canning was negotiating an agreement with Abdul-Mejid to permit British retail outlets to open in the city and the empire. Canning wanted to make it possible for English entrepreneurs like George to open shops. Bearing these in mind, here are a few of the ways Canning helped George. As you listen, understand that their exchanges were limited to fleeting conversations, as George ushered Canning from his front door at Terapia, right here, through the garden to the gate and the quay, where a boat waited to convey the ambassador into town. It was through these haphazard exchanges that Canning got to know George, also because Mrs. Canning was using George to run errands for her, like distributing alms to the poor. Both were apparently impressed by him. So the first favor Canning did for George was to allow him to pursue his nursery business independent of his work for the embassy. George's notebook shows that the day after he climbed ashore at Terapia, he was already busy propagating plants, not so much for the embassy gardens he was there to install. That was a good 7 years down the road, but for selling to clients at the British and European expatriate communities, along with his advice on garden care and landscaping and his oversight of the installation, all free of charge. If George was taking any money, it would have been reimbursement for plants ordered and shipped out from Knight's nursery, not for plants he cultivated on site at Terapia. Canning was fine with all of this. None of it was a problem. Then, about a year later, in 1850, Canning gave George permission to sell his plants for great sums of money. Son Arthur wrote, George Baker took credit for bringing one of the best known apples in Turkey to Turkey. It was originally from Asia and was a large apple, 2.5 by 3 inches in diameter, yellow with black needle spots. He took cuttings and sold them. He introduced the wisteria to Turkey and charged £5 a plant. In today's money, £5 amounts to a whopping £661 per wisteria cutting. Imagine, the price alone indicates just how rare and valuable the plant was. And at that price, who could afford it other than the richest man in the empire, Sultan Abdul-Mejid and his family members? The second favor Canning did for George was to encourage his relationship with the Sultan. Shortly after he arrived, George began doing jobs for Mejid. I have no documentation on this, but according to independent family sources, he installed the gardens at Dolmabahce Palace and at other palaces along the Bosphorus. This from his grandson, Victor Binns, quote, he laid out some gardens along the Bosphorus and was invited to design and landscape the new gardens and innumerable lawns for the Sultan's palaces. When finished, the Dolmabahce Palace had acres of roses dotted with fountains where the silver water turned to emerald, ruby, and gold as it ran over the colored mosaics decorating the fountains. Sultan Abdul-Mejid is reputed to have commented that George Baker had laid out such beautiful flower beds that there were now colored carpets both inside and outside the palaces. Dolmabahce was going up at the same time as the British Palace and was in competition for materials and labor. It goes without saying that George could not have worked at Dolmabahce Palace without Canning's consent. Also from the embassy working at Dolmabahce was British architect William J. Smith. His main mission in Turkey was to build the new embassy, but he was also moonlighting for the Sultan. At Dolmabahce, Smith was building the Crystal Pavilion, a winter garden, a bird sanctuary, and a greenhouse. If George wasn't involved in design, he and Smith must have worked together. George would have been consulted on how these structures might be best designed and situated within the broader garden layout. Smith himself was doing an abundance of building for the Sultan all over town. I don't know about the other projects, but for the construction of Dolmabahce, he was using British materials imported from England, ostensibly for the new embassy, or tacking orders onto shipments designated for the new embassy. His accountings must have been a marvel, and it sounds pretty dodgy, but Canning was okay with it for about 10 years, from 1842 to 53, until he wasn't anymore and called for Smith to be fired. Canning realized that Smith was overextended, that his moonlighting was preventing him from finishing the embassy, and that infuriated him. Then it came to his attention that Smith was accepting gifts and compensation that he wasn't reporting to the embassy. For Canning, it was the last straw. Smith had to go. Smith returned to London in 1853. He was not fired, but retired 2 years later. So Smith had to go, but George did not. He didn't get into trouble. Why was that? Well, aside from any congeniality he and Canning have enjoyed, Canning decided that the friendly relationship George was forming with the Sultan could be useful to him. George's regular visits to Topkapi and Dolmabahce palaces to deliver plant shipments and go over his design ideas with the Sultan, and soon to deliver linen orders and other imports from England, gave George the opportunity to gather scuttlebutt from the Sultan and his minions and report it back to Canning. George was another pair of eyes and ears in Canning's documented coterie of informal spies at the Ottoman court. Another one was Sir Austin, the famed archaeologist who was living in the same villa with George at Terapia and with whom he became great friends. The third favor Canning did for George was to facilitate his acquisition of 2 properties in Galata, from which he launched his new business. When, thanks to Medjid, George abandoned his nursery ambition and pivoted into trade, Canning was all for it. During the Crimean War, when George started supplying the Turkish army with, quote, blankets and boots, Canning allowed George to keep his profits and thereby build up a capital reserve for the business to come, even though George was still employed. It makes perfect sense because Canning was pursuing a retail trade agreement with Medjid. It's even possible Canning suggested the idea to George. George, my boy, forget the nursery business. You're better off going into trade. I think you should open a shop. I'll help you. And though the evidence is circumstantial, that's exactly what Canning did. Not long after the embassy celebrated its grand opening in Pera in January 1856, George resigned. He moved from Terapia to Galata, and with his profits from the Crimean War, he bought or long leased an apartment and a shop. The shop was at 2 Kule Kapısı on the Galata Tower Square, right across from the tower entrance. Today, I believe it's the building at number 2 Büyükhendek Caddesi. The residence apartment was a block away, around the corner at today's number 9 Galata Kulesi Sokak, which descends steeply from Galata Tower Square down the hill towards the Golden Horn. Since the shop building had no address at the time, George made one up. He called it Prospect Place and painted it in red on the front corner of the building. His business letterhead read simply, George Baker, Prospect Place, Pera, Constantinople. Prospect Place was a play on the double meaning of prospect, to mean both interesting overlook, a reference to the old Turkish cemetery that in those days descended the hill below Galata Tower, and hopeful future, referring to his business and prospects as a tradesman. Prospect Place. George renowned for his wry sense of humor. Mind you, this weekend, my husband and I learned that Prospect Place may have been the name of William George Middleton's nursery. It needs a little more research, but I'm just throwing it out there to blow your mind because it blew ours. Baker's shop at Prospect Place was one of the first British retail outlets to open in Constantinople, and it formed the foundation of George's next shop on the Grand Rue de Pera, today's Istiklal, which was indeed the first British department store in Turkey. What's especially curious about this first residence and shop is their location in Galata. They were at the top end of what was called the British consular sector. The British government had been building up this part of town since Canning got there in 1842. When all was said and done 40 plus years later, the corridor along Galata Kulesi Sokak included a British hospital, the hospital director's residence, a post office, shipping office, consular offices, the consul general's residence, the consular courts, a police station, and a jail. In other words, it was prime British government real estate. So how did George Baker, the lowly embassy gardener, come to own or long lease these two properties? It's astonishing on the face of it, quite aside from the competition George faced from a plethora of other enterprising young Englishmen who'd gone out to Turkey for one reason or another in the 1840s and 50s and decided to stay on to start a business and make their millions. Any one of them, or any one of the Britishers who'd been operating in the city since the 1830s, like the Hansons and Sarrels and Whittals, names some of you will recognize, all of them would have given their eye teeth for these two properties. That George got to cut to the head of the line indicates that Canning had to be behind it. He was the only man in town with that sort of power. Also consider that Canning and the embassy staff vacated their temporary quarters in the consular sector when they moved into the new British palace in November 1855. George resigned and moved to Galata in the spring-summer of 1856. Was the timing a coincidence, or does it suggest a connection? Did George occupy premises that Canning and his staff had vacated a few months before? It seems quite possible. The second man to have a decisive role in George's dramatic trajectory in Turkey was Sultan Abdülmecid. Mecid was just a year younger than George, and they shared a passion for landscaping and gardens. When Mecid was not meeting with his ministers or hanging out with his women in the royal harem, he was puttering in his gardens. As ruler of the by now ailing Ottoman Empire, Mecid's political objectives were first to strengthen Turkey's alliance with Britain and France to offset the threat of another Russian invasion in Russia's perennial efforts to take Turkish territories and seize control of the Bosphorus. The Russians invaded anyway in the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, but thanks to Mecid's policies, Britain and France came to Turkey's defense. Second, to bring the empire up to European standards in education, administration, the military, the judiciary, urban development, etc., etc. His reforms, which his father Mahmud II had begun, affected every aspect of life. And third, among other things, to please his mother and his women in the royal harem. Mecid was notorious for being very fond of his harem. According to John Freely, former professor at Robert College, and so much more, Mecid produced more children by more women than any sultan before or after him. Aside from the conviviality that emerged between George and the Sultan, Mecid's political agenda intersected nicely with George's ambitions. How so? Well, had George followed the forestry business, Mecid wanted to sell him a swath of land behind Dolmabahce Palace precisely for this purpose. Second, by the onset of the Crimean War, George was already doing a brisk business with the royal palace. Starting with linen sales, it had expanded to ladies' toiletries, perfumes, colognes, soap, face powders, and handkerchiefs. Then came contracts with the military for blankets and boots. In sum, the war was a commercial boon for George. And since Canning was letting him keep his profits, He saved up enough for a smooth transition from Terapia to Galata and from gardening into trade. Third, he was a softy when it came to his mother, Besmealem Valide Sultan, and his harem. He was famous for spoiling them with gifts and granting them too many liberties. Get this, he was chastised in the European press for not keeping his ladies on a tight enough leash. Besmealem was criticized for showing her veiled face in Pera rather too frequently. While in Pera, I hasten to add, she and her entourage were exposed to how the Europeans were dressing themselves, dining in restaurants, and decorating their homes. This tickled their curiosity and whet their appetite. As the ranking female at court, Besmealem was the trendsetter of the Ottoman elite. If she was wearing it or using it in her palace apartments, whatever it was fair game and a must-have for any Turk who could afford it. Enter George Baker. Turk or European, their wish was his command. Fourth, Canning and Britain were more than willing to assist Medjid in every aspect of his modernization campaign. It was good business for Britain. The result was a large British presence in the city, the building boom in Galata that I just mentioned, for example. In the 1840s and 50s, the city was inundated by British contractors, builders, lawyers, architects, Army and Navy advisors, urban planners, financial and legal advisors. You get the picture. Those who decided to stay were George's competition, both in housing and in trade. But thanks to Canning and the Sultan, George was way ahead of them. This situation also meant that when George opened his Gallop at the end of the war, he had a huge market eagerly awaiting his luxury imports from England. Swelling populations of British, French, Swedes, and Italians, and by then he'd already established a healthy clientele among the Turkish aristocracy. George's customer base was whoever could afford his high-end merchandise, no matter their race or religion. And his merchandise eventually included anything he could get from England of high quality at a reasonable price. The shop at Galata Square led to the department store at number 207 Grand Rue de Pera, to another at number 370, and another at number 500, and another at 500 Yüksek Kaldırım, and to a variety of boutiques specializing in hats and shoes or women's clothing. But by far the biggest favor Medjid did for George was to pivot him into trade. Medjid was George's first retail customer, even counting his earlier plant sales, such as those expensive wisteria cuttings I mentioned. Shortly after George arrived in May 1848, he met with Medjid in the gardens of Topkapi Palace. He was there to deliver a gift from Queen Victoria, a collection of exotic fruit trees from all over the world, which Kew Gardens had assembled for him to take with him. Canning may have been present to make the presentation and introduce George, the new master gardener sent from Kew. Sadly, this page is missing from George's notebook. We only know it secondhand from his son Arthur. Quote, a list of the trees in his diary shows that Kew had collected trees from many parts, even from Central Asia. Father's diary speaks of taking the collection to Topkapi Palace Gardens and seeing the Sultan, Abdul Medjid, digging. Father notes that his trousers were badly cut and that he needed a tailor. Father did not know that the Ottoman style of clothing was then in a transition state. The Turks were going away from the old baggy breeches in favor of slimmer Europeans. George and Medjid hit it off, of that much we can be sure. And we can assume they compared notes on their mutual interest in gardening. Moving forward, Medjid ordered plants from Knight's Nursery and recruited George to help design the gardens at Dolmabahce Palace and other palaces along the Bosphorus as mentioned. Canning never objected because George was a useful channel for palace gossip. Between the three men, the 61-year-old Büyük Elçi, or Great Ambassador as Medjid liked to call him, and the two 20-something garden fanatics, it was a congenial win-win-win. When the ladies in the harem heard about Medjid and his new British friend or observe them talking in the garden through their latticed palace windows, they begged the Padishah to ask George if he might get them some Irish linen, in addition to the Padishah's beloved exotic plants. Majid put the question to George, and like a genie in the bottle, he replied, "Yes, I can do that." This was because he had just received, or was just about to get, a letter from Brother James at the linen factory back in London, asking if he might try selling some samples locally. One order followed the next, and that, my friends, is how George Baker got into trade. He was blessed with some amazingly serendipitous good karma. In 1966, George took his older children back to England. He had business to do with Brother James, and he was putting his two older children, Louisa and GP, into boarding school. This photo was taken on that trip. Notice the spiffy suits the boys are wearing, which their Uncle Frank had probably tailored for them. Arthur's jacket is big enough to last more than a couple of years. Look at his left sleeve. On this trip, George took the children home to visit his parents and to the Virgo nursery to meet William. It was the only time the children met these Baker relatives of theirs. William and George seemed to know that they were related because son GP remembered it being so. But GP wasn't quite sure how exactly. He guessed that William was George's step-uncle or step-brother, but a blood relative seemed to be out of the question. Was it a cover story that George had fed his children, or was it a cover story that George had been fed as a child? We can never know. And what was George's purpose in these visits? The children never saw these relatives again. The latter had no presence in their lives. I don't know what George was thinking, but he seemed to be making a point. To his father, certainly, but also to his brother, William. He'd left home a waif, and he'd left England at the top of his gardening game. And now he was back, a wealthy and respected merchant. He was a true Victorian gentleman who could afford to buy his children fine suits and send them to expensive boarding schools, who could afford to support his parents in their old age and prevent them from heading to the workhouse to die. George had arrived. Thanks to Ambassador Canning and Sultan Abdul Majid, thanks to Joseph Knight and William George Middleton, and with help from his sister Catherine and his brother James, George laid the groundwork for 3 lines of business: imports and retail through his shops and department stores, imports and wholesale contracts with the Turkish government and military, and back-channel sales too, guaranteeing excellent relations with the royal palace and whoever was in power. In the mid-1870s, George partnered with Charlie Edwards, who had married his eldest daughter, Louisa. To these lines of, this is Charlie, and this is Louisa. To these lines of business, Charlie added exports to the UK, representational agencies, meaning the Bakers represented other firms in Turkey for a cut, and the all-important carpet trade, which made them all 3 times richer, at least. Though GP takes credit for the idea, the correspondence between him and Charlie, which we can be grateful to GP for saving, show beyond a doubt that it was Charlie Edwards's brainchild. This foundation, combined with the Baker business model that James will touch on, would continue growing the business until World War I. I could go on to explain how the forces of history brought the Turkish end of the business, G&A Baker Limited, to its end in 1964, 110 years after its official establishment in 1854. That would be the riches to rags story of George's less fortunate son, Arthur Baker, who inherited the Istanbul business when George died in 1905. Meanwhile, the London side of the business, led by sons GP and Jim Baker, recovered after the war and is still, remarkably, going strong to this day. It's another aspect of the Baker story, which my cousin James will now tell you all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was excellent. So if you'd like to stop sharing, and then James.
Yep.
Okay.
Right. Can you see that?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Gillian, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about George Baker's two sons, Percival, known as GP, and Jim, my great-grandfather, and to look at their business activities, other interests, as well as their legacies, and to try and get a little into their characters. So here's a picture of the five boys, five sons. Eldest daughter Louisa and youngest Millie aren't obviously in the picture. Harry, top left, died sadly at 48 of cholera. Jim, standing next to him, 8 years younger than the oldest GP. Arthur on the right, every inch the accountant and businessman who did so much to shape and grow George's business empire in Turkey. GP with his dog, and Fred on the left, who was cut out of his father's orbit as he had decided to do his own thing back in England. And for whatever reason, his father didn't really approve of that. So let's first step back and look at George Baker's business model. There were four elements to this. First, hire only friends and family. This included four of his five sons and one of his two sons-in-law. Two, support each other in all ways possible, to include pooling funds and resources and teams of people. Three, always grow the business and try and innovate. And four, diversify. Looking at this last element, as Gillian mentioned, the G&A Baker business were agents for manufacturers in Europe and the USA of all these types of businesses: aircraft, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, tanning products. They were importing and exporting. Export in the middle, mainly agricultural, back to Britain, and then importing for their retail outlets and also for the wholesale business, everything and anything. So our story continues with GP and Jim. George Baker had returned to London to conduct business with his brother James. His brother had certainly played a big part in George's commercial success, supplying him with goods from London. 18-year-old GP had returned home to Turkey from 5 years schooling in England the year before. He suddenly got an urgent telegram from his father in London telling him that his uncle James had suddenly died and that George needed GP to return to London immediately to take on the wholesale part of the business in Cutler Street in London. So, as Gillian mentioned, in 1875, naval architect Charlie Edwards had married George's eldest child, Louisa, and had joined George Baker in a retail venture, Baker and Edwards, and had later built a large carpet warehouse in Constantinople. It was Charlie rather than George who spotted the market potential for beautiful Turkish carpets. Legend has it that Queen Victoria stopped at an inn for a royal pee and spotted a couple of beautiful rugs on the floor of the inn and inquired where they were from. This resulted in Baker's receiving orders from Buckingham Palace for the Queen's residences, and the popularity of these rugs really took off. Baker's rode the wave. After 4 years, George was delighted with GP's efforts and gave him a belated 21st birthday present of a holiday trekking and climbing in Persia, along with 3 of GP's school friends. Before the trip, GP and his father visited a carpet factory in Persia organised by Charlie Edwards to understand the manufacturing process and to secure quality carpets to sell into London and also into Paris. George returned to Constantinople, and GP and his school friends then headed to Mount Ararat to trek and also collect samples of plants. It was this trip that stimulated GP's lifelong interest in climbing and botany. Obviously, his father's background in horticulture must have been a contributing factor. In fact, you can see in this picture that GP has got a pickaxe, and this was probably taken after the trip. He's looking rather exhausted. He also came back from the trip with a small archive of cotton print designs, probably Indian, similar to these ones. And he got designed up. So he got the designer to take little elements of the design, say that bit, and replicate those into a block. And he got a local printworks, Swaslands in Kent, to print these up onto fabrics, and he started selling them. They sold really well. In addition, the carpets were going really well. These are examples of the sort of carpets from the 1880s that he would have been selling from Charlie, who was shipping them back to him in London. So returning to London from the trip, GP's business model had changed. One, he was still wholesaler to his father, George Baker, back in Turkey, supplying everything and anything. But two, he was seller of Turkish rugs in increasing quantities from Baker and Edwards in Constantinople. And three, the fabrics from the Persian trip, which he'd redesigned and produced in Kent, were beginning to sell really well. In 1887, Jim, his youngest brother, joins GP in London. Presumably his father had seen something in Jim's character, having employed him in the Constantinople shops and in Usak selecting carpets, to persuade George that he would be a good fit for GP. GP initially found his much younger brother wasn't serious and business focused enough, but Jim was soon knocked into shape by his older, bossy and perhaps domineering brother. They divided their attentions, with GP growing the fabrics part and Jim concentrating on the carpet side. In 1892, 5 years after Jim's arrival, their father gave them each £5,500. That's a total of 1.8 million in today's money, pounds that is, to establish a new business. George asked them to come up with a name, and they chose GP&J Baker Limited. Hardly original, but it kept the pattern with G&A Baker back in Turkey. Undoubtedly, the brothers needed this injection to take them to a higher level, and George was also keen to secure his legacy and diversify his business interests. The money allowed the business to take a lease on a much larger warehouse for the carpet business in Newgate Street, with carts coming in from the nearby docks. The building lease was later taken on by the OCM, which I'll come on to. The inside was a great place for mainly trade buyers from, for example, the West End department stores to come and browse and select carpets. One of the issues GP had was ensuring that the business could meet customers' orders for new fabrics in a timely manner. 2 years later, the brothers purchased the Swaslands printworks, which I mentioned earlier, in Kent. This is a big undertaking, particularly as the works needed investment and had suffered poor industrial relations, being part of the early Chartist movement. GP worked day and night there, living with his family in a house next door to the site and doing all he could to improve the worker relations. The company purchased a new 10-colour press, leapfrogging competitors for quality and timely dispatch of new orders. This photograph shows the block printing part of the factory taken in the late 1950s, but the methods were essentially unchanged from the previous century. Within 10 years, the brothers were employing some of the leading designers of the time. They had 57 designers, a staggering 57 in the design team. They were also employing artists such as CFA Vosey, William Turner, and others, and developed the large naturalistically drawn English garden flowers and fruit, which is the baker's trademark today. GP was influenced by Oriental flora and fauna and birds, and he became a leading authority on printed historical Indian clothes, fabric printing, and irises. In addition, he was collecting archived fabric collections, which the company draws on today. Baker's also established selling agents around the UK, Europe, USA, Canada, and Australia. Here I'll quickly go through a couple of the current designs or current products. This one was actually designed in 1873 by Kate Faulkner and first produced by the company in 1885. not in those colours. Those are contemporary colours, but the design is, I think, the same. Now the second one is from Vosey, who I mentioned earlier. This is very arts and crafts, again, today's design, but an original design from 1902. And then the third design is one from 1910 from William Turner, which is the very quintessential baker's look. Obviously digitized, makes recoloring these much easier. So I wanted really to, I knew a lot about GP from the records, from his obituary, etc., but very little about Jim. And I really wanted to find out a bit more, helped to a degree from family correspondence and letters in Anthony Wynn's book, 3 Camels from Smyrna. Some of you will remember Anthony's talk from 10 years ago on the Oriental carpet manufacturer's business. So I'm only going to talk briefly about this in relation to Jim. Family recollections recount endless deeds of goodwill by him, such as employing family members in the business, help with money matters, and other small kindnesses, plus his enduring relationship with his wife Edith. But there was much, much more to him than this slightly saccharine view. Jim had become a carpet expert from his early days in Usak and Constantinople with his dad, and since joining his brother in London. Various letters in Anthony's book from an 18-year-old Harry Banfield trying to establish himself as a carpet agent in India recounts this of Jim in a series of letters back to his mother in England, perhaps slightly awestruck. So he says, "Baker is as hard as nails. He weighs 13 stone in his skin, 6 foot 1 inch, and a good shot and a rider. He seems at home anywhere, and as far as I saw, a really good sort and a gentleman." A few years later, he writes, "JB and I did a lot of work, and we're really starting a new and better kind of carpet for France, all with white grounds and very soft colours. We also recolored a lot of carpets with the very soft dull terrors, camels, creams, blues, pinks, etc. for America as well as England too." Another letter from Harry in the same year shows Jim's dynamism and impatience with what he saw as bureaucracy and not getting the right price for a service. Harry's hero worship continues. "He's a wonderful chap, is JB. He stormed the offices of ES Railways at Calcutta and found a man in government whose job is to look after trade and who no one else saw, and came away with flying colours, having all round managed to save us £300 a year on the freight of our goods between here and London." So by the first decade of the new century, Baker's had established itself as a leading carpet trader in London, aided by the brothers and their staff's good reputation. In 1907, the OCM was formed. Effectively, the enterprise was to form a manufacturing and sales cartel to the detriment of other manufacturers and sellers. Jim and GP were one of the principal shareholders in this venture, putting in 53,000 into the new company, the equivalent of over 8 million in today's money. And the company had its HQ in Smyrna. The composition allowed the new business to be fully vertically integrated, i.e. control all aspects of the manufacture and sale of Turkish carpets, and in time the Persian and Indian carpets in the UK, European and US markets. In a short time, Jim became the general manager. He set up a new agent centres, for example, in Persia, and ensures manufacturing centres in Turkey and India are addressing any quality issues around the dye, patterns and other manufacturing defects quickly. The OCM becomes successful very quickly and returns 14% on capital in its first full year. The good times continued for about a decade, and the organisation gained a dominant market control in the areas they were operating in. Taking his father's business model mantra, Jim brings on board his nephew Cecil Edwards, son of his sister Louisa and Charlie Edwards, initially as manager in Persia and then later as managing director of the OCM. A series of letters from 1911 found in Jim's diary from Jim to wife Edith, which he always started with "my dear old lady," indicate a very serious problem the OCM experienced with a boycott and threats of violence from some loom owners to OCM staff and suppliers, which was spreading from Turkey into Persia. Threats that Jim saw largely as bluff, but clearly British diplomats saw as very real. They must have been a worry to Edith back at home. Jim had based himself for a number of weeks in the offices of a fellow OCM shareholder, Sidney Lafontaine, in Smyrna, to try and sort this out, but had gone on to Persia in this incident. Here, he's describing a meeting between Jim, British Ambassador Berkeley, and the Iranian Prime Minister Sayed al-Dawla. Jim says, "We were taken through 3 rooms with a great many people, all sitting in groups on the carpets. After a few minutes, in came the Serpador," I presume the Prime Minister. The great man, about 5'10", thin, badly dressed, shook hands with me, then had a few words with Berkeley on the political question of the day, and then my turn came. The fact I spoke Turkish helped. Berkeley explained my mission in Persia, the boycott, the threats. He rang a bell. A man came in and told him to take me all over the house to see all his 300-odd carpets. On my return, I told him he had a fine stock. He replied that he had lots more and was ready to sell them. Jim, ever the trader. He continues, we then came back to the question of the boycott. He said he would call a meeting of the principal merchants, the names of whom I'd given him. This meeting is fixed for this afternoon, so I will report results in my next. Jim's meeting was a success as the boycott was called off immediately in Persia and fizzled out in Turkey. The good times continued for about a decade, and the organisation gained a dominant market control in the areas they were operating in. But the First World War would radically change things. A couple of tragic asides relating to Jim and GP. Jim was returning to England from business in New York on board the Lusitania liner. At about 2:10 p.m, there was a sudden series of loud bangs and shuddering. The liner had been hit by 2 torpedoes, which caused the boat to list badly to the starboard side. Jim's cabin was on the port side. He and 2 friends managed to launch with great difficulty some of the lifeboats which were getting caught in the badly listing boat. Unfortunately, the vessel sank within 20 minutes with the loss of 1,193 lives, many of them American. There were 761 survivors, including Jim. This would be the catalyst that brought the United States into the First World War. Jim was commended for his actions and later testified at a Board of Trade inquiry. Another tragedy from the First World War was that GP and Minnie, his wife, lost 3 sons, Cyril, Douglas in action, Frank in East Africa, who had contracted malaria and dysentery, which fatally affected his brain. This came on top of losing their daughter Daisy years earlier, and their children's deaths would affect both parents for the rest of their lives. Cyril had been working for the OCM before the war and showed great promise. He died in action in Macedonia. GP writes these words in family notes several decades later: brutally stark and stiff upper lip stuff. Life went on after the awfulness of World War I, but would have severe repercussions for all businesses, and the OCM was no different. For Jim and the OCM, after the war, things took time to get back to something resembling normality, with problems around old dyes stock, as described here in correspondence back to GP in London. Later that year, a really serious incident was a fire in Smyrna, which destroyed the town and quayside and OCM warehouse and all its stock. International consensus says the fire was started in the city by the Turks, trying to flush out the Greeks and Armenians from their houses, which then spread to the quayside. I'm astounded Jim hadn't had enough, but he soldiered on and retired from the OCM in 1926, aged 62, and handed the OCM baton on to his nephew Cecil Edwards, who would continue to run the OCM as managing director for several decades. But the best years were behind them, with the advancement of mechanization of carpets, tariffs, and other political reasons. Moving on, this photo was taken on GP's retirement in 1933. Apart from Cecil, who worked for the OCM, all the three boys were employed in the family business, with Ronald, Jim's son, here heading up the design and sales part, and Brian running the factory at Crayford. Some further family photographs, Jim and Edith in old age, and GP's wife, Minnie. And then this was taken in 1938 at Fred's house in Cornwall. Fred was the brother who'd returned to England. Jim, poor man, here suffered from Parkinson's, and I think is showing it a little bit in this photograph. He died in 1944, aged 80. The last few years, his Parkinson's got progressively worse and was described as a living death by a relation towards the end. GP died in 1951, GP here, at the good age of 94. GP Baker Aris is named after GP in acknowledgement of his association with the plant and the British Aris Society. And there's Tulipa Bakery, which Gillian, I think other relations possibly on this Zoom call have growing in their gardens. So after the First World War, the reputation of the business continued to grow in the interwar years as Baker's continued to expand its range of fabrics and designs. This is one of my favourites, Ferns, from 1935, created textile artist Joseph M. Doran, based on a series of botanical drawings from 1780 of various firms in the London area. Like much of business, the Second World War had a serious impact. Here I have to do some guesswork and it's still work in progress, so I'm always looking for help on this. But problems had begun to build in the 50s. Undoubtedly, World War II had a profound effect on the business. This is GP&J Baker business. Here I'm guessing, but maybe Bakers hadn't adapted to a more utilitarian world with small geometric patterns and brighter colours. The factory was printing for the competition, i.e. Warner's, Liberty's and others, which meant that orders for their own fabrics were slow to be fulfilled. With the two cousins running the business, matters went adrift, and they weren't able or didn't want to address the decline in fortunes. A family member close to this reckoned that whilst Ronald was a great salesman and excellent with design and colours, he wasn't commercial, and probably his cousin Brian wasn't either. I wonder how much investment was going into the Crayford factory. Did they actually still need a factory rather than outsourcing manufacturing? Maybe they needed a commercial CEO to help them. The company was sold in 1964 through an administration process to the furniture maker Parker Knoll, and they invested into the range, sales and marketing. In 1982, the company was awarded its royal warrants, and in 1984, the V&A Museum held a prestigious exhibition on the business's fabrics. This is the book that was published to commemorate the exhibition. Mike Cutliff, GP's grandson, who had worked with Ronald, retained the family connection as sales export director. In 2000, Baker's was acquired by the New York-based Cravat Group, and it heads up their list of well-known brands. In the 23 years, they have restored Baker's to its position as one of the leading fabric brands in the UK and perhaps the world, utilising their logistics and distribution centre in Poole and a very large design centre in Chelsea Harbour. So just quickly, a couple of links to their website. This is their principal brand. I'm not sure what they call it, but the heritage brand. So traditional GP Baker designs. And then they have a Baker's and slightly brighter, more geometric, patterned, aimed possibly at a different market. So just to conclude, I think that the business that the brothers started 134 years ago would still be recognizable to them today. And they and their father George, which should and would be proud that their legacies live on today. Thank you very much.
James, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. So if you'd like to stop sharing, we'll go straight into any questions or comments that people have. Does anyone want to jump in? Quick question, otherwise I will start. Gillian, so the Wallaces went west and George Baker went east. So obviously George had connecting east, but why did the Wallaces go west? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. We don't know. I mean, they just decided they'd try their luck in the US. A few family sources speculated, but it wasn't accurate, that he was working for a British consulate or British embassy in New York or Florida or California. None of that was true. And we have a Wallace family member here who knows all about what happened to them, but they went to upstate New York, and he was gardening. He was hiring himself out to the big estate holders along the Hudson. But his wife died shortly after they got to the States. It's not even clear she got to upstate New York. And he had a baby on his hands and 4 other children, and he quickly remarried and then went out to Chicago. There, it appears he was mangled in an unfortunate train accident, and that left the kids. We have differing stories on his second wife. She may have died too shortly thereafter. But 2 of the 2 younger girls went back to and were made servants of their uncles, who were the market gardeners. And one of them worked long enough to make enough money to go back to the States and live with her older sister. The other one, unfortunately, went mad and ended up being institutionalized. Quite a sad story.
Yes, very sad. Questions or comments from anybody else? Anybody from the Wide Baker family want to jump in? Yeah, Mark Willingale.
Yes, I've got one if I may. Well, first of all, thank you very much. A superb talk. It seems Stratford Canning's quite an astute character here. I can't recall whether it's Philip Mansell or John Julius Norwich, but if you read them, they'll say that the head gardener was a very senior person in Ottoman administration. Frankly, a leading person to organize military campaigns and everything else. So although in the English here, a head gardener doesn't seem very significant, it was in the Ottoman world. And it seems to me that Stratford Canning have known this, and he must have made George into this important character to connect with Majid. And it was obviously very successful indeed. Is there any more information on that? Because that's one of the reasons why the Sultan would find George a very significant character.
That's very interesting. I know of Norwich and Mansell, but I hadn't come across that.
Well, it's worth researching that, I think, because the head gardeners in the Ottoman world, obviously it's a slightly earlier period, but still influential traditionally, were leading people in the society.
Right, but what I was going on was the British embassy hiring, before George and after George, they were always locally hired. So
that's for the actual British embassy, but But
Right.
Stratford Canning feeds that to Dolmabahce, etc., knowing, I'm sure, that
Right.
traditionally in the Ottoman world, the head gardener was a very senior man indeed. He basically ran the administration for the Ottomans, like a kind of prime minister, a leading, I think the term was. So I'd certainly recommend looking into that, because
Absolutely.
that would be why he would be received, because of course the British collections and being able to produce exotic plants like wisteria would have really gone down extremely powerfully in the Ottoman tradition.
I agree with you.
I want to declare a hand here that my wife was born in the Tarabia Gardens, and her father was the head gardener for the consulate, Pera. He's passed now, but so partly the story in the background there. He was the head gardener for the embassy, consulate building in Pera. But anyway, I think it's a fascinating story.
Most of the information I got about Tarapia, other than when I went there twice, was from Mark Willingale. So thank you very much.
It's a very beautiful garden, by the way. I mean, it's the whole of the European shore has been very much damaged by development. But of course, the European and Russian embassies still have their gardens. But the best, I have to say, is still the British one, completed since 1911. But superb terraces, and it's a wonderful place.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Jane.
Yes. Hi, I'm Gillian's sister. And Gillian, I just want to congratulate you for what you've done. I wrote a note to our cousins recently saying that I went to Robert College from 66 to 68 when our family, when the rest of the family lived in Ankara. And at least 2 days a week, I had to walk up the hill because my class was at 11 o'clock. And I said in this that I always used to think about the bakers as I was climbing that hill. And but always with this tinge of sadness that we would really never know what happened. And I just wanted to say, I can't remember, Gillian, when you started this, but it's certainly been at least 10 years, I think. And I just want to say, oh my God, you really have done it. Congratulations. And I can't wait until it's in print. And well done.
Well, I'd like to give a shout out to Stacy Rabine, who is a Wallace descendant. Stacy, you can unmute yourself and say hello, because most of today's story came from documents she unearthed in Britain. Public records, yes. Say hi.
Hi. I got lost there for a minute and had to reconnect. I don't know what happened. So yeah, I was very happy to meet you, and we just kind of connected and really found things together about the bakers and my family. If you want to hear what happened, is like, you know, they got to America and almost instantly Catherine died. We don't know what of, we don't know exactly where, we don't know if it was on the ship. It doesn't show up on the manifest, but she just pretty much stepped off and died. And then within that year, her husband, John, remarried, and they had their 5 children. They were still in New York. They were in Tarrytown, New York. Then for some reason, they up and moved to Chicago. They moved to Chicago, worked there. He was pretty much a laborer. You know, he's supposed to be doing gardening, you know, building gardens and stuff, but, you know, he had a lot to do with lumber and stuff like that. And then there was a tragic incident for him where they were doing something with lumber in a train yard, and something bumped him down into the train yard. He got run over by a train. So now they've got 5 kids that are virtually homeless. But the Mogul that John Wallace had worked for, he kind of helped to get places for the kids to go. He actually took over or took over the care of the youngest boy. His name was George, and helped him, make a life. He became an Episcopalian priest. There was, let's see, who else? My great grandfather, he was already like 18 years old, and he had stayed in New York. He also lived there for a while. He went to Civil War from New York. When he came back to New York, shortly afterwards, he picked up his family and moved to Leadville, Colorado, which is fairly close to where I am, like 3-4 hours away. But that's where they lived, way up in the mountains above Leadville, and were miners. And before that, he was also a gardener. So he did gardening he built a business, a garden shop business in Leadville, at the same time moving up further the mountain. So he was fine, and we're fine, we're here. But there were 2 other daughters. One was Catherine, named after her mother. She ended up going with John Wallace's sister and her husband. And she wasn't with them for very long. But she got to be about 18, I think, 16, 18, when, like, right in a row, the 2 of her aunt and uncle died. So she took a long time to find, but she did come back to America. And then the last one was Jessie. She actually met kind of the worst end of the whole thing. She went back to England to live with her 2 uncles who were market gardeners, but they never married, and she never married. And she actually, both 2 of them, one of the uncles and herself, they ended up dying in an asylum. So that bad, but mostly they all kind of came through it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments for anybody? Yes, Mike Levitt.
Hi, Gillian, a quick question. I remember in the late 1950s, on our way back out to Tehran, we stopped in Istanbul and visited what I remember as being a great aunt of our father's. Do you know who that might have been?
Louisa.
Louisa, because she lived in a big old house down on the edge of the Bosphorus, and I was always terribly impressed with.
It's a very famous Yali on the Bosphorus. Yalanli Yali, snake.
Okay.
Yali.
Was there a picture of it in your presentation of that house?
No, I didn't get that far.
Okay.
Got to Zeki Pasha Yali.
That being,
it's in the book.
Well, no,
it's
shortly there's going to be on the website. It's about 100 pages. It's a summary of all 3 books. Half of it is photographs. It's definitely in there.
great.
All sorts of Arthur Baker's drawing of it, old photographs of it, new photographs of it, because it's been very nicely renovated.
That's a good point. Thanks, Mike. That's a good point, Gillian, is that, what we aim to do with the Levantine Heritage website is to make these records available, if the authors permit. So, there will be an enduring record both of the talk, but some of the curated sort of documents behind it, the book. But I think, Gillian, you would ideally like to find a publisher for your book. Am I thinking correctly?
You're thinking very correctly.
So if anyone's got any ideas, suggestions?
The 3 books they stand on their own. The middle one is solely about George Baker, and then the last one is about his son Arthur. So that's the riches to rags story alluded to. The first one is the romance of my grandparents, which was on the Bosphorus, but it's a little different. So we have other avenues for publishing that.
Okay, thank you. James, a quick one for you. What happened to OCM? What happened to the carpet side of the business?
Well, it continued and basically fizzled out. It went through lots of different ownerships. I don't actually know what happened to the Baker shareholding. I suspect the banks had got their sort of clause into it fairly early on, and when things started getting awry in the sort of late 20s, the shareholding dissipated or disappeared. Eventually it was sold through in the 80s, I think, through Bowater. Do you remember Bowater Paper? It became part of that, and I think it then fizzled out in the 80s. But actually in Anthony's book, Anthony Wynne, he says right at the end that he was going through Tehran airport and stopped off at a carpet shop and saw an elderly merchant there, and he introduced himself, and he said Anthony had worked for the OCM, and he said, oh, the carpet trader must have been in his 70s or 80s. Oh, the OCM, they were good people. They were honest people. So I rather like that. But it was a bit of a sad ending, really, because I think mechanization, tariffs in the 20s, it became very political. There were various, including the British government and the US government, that put tariffs on carpets coming in from the OCM because they thought they were being exploited, and the OCM made a very strong case that wasn't the case, that it was actually the reverse, and those tariffs were then removed. But that's what happened, I think.
All right, thank you. Caroline.
Hey, thank you so much. What an amazing, both of the presentations. Thank you such. I have a question for James. My great uncle, Hagop Martmanian, as a young man in Smyrna, joined OCM in 1910. And so I'm wondering if the files, the papers of OCM are accessible. Are they in an archives?
They're not. I mean, there's a YouTube video of Anthony Wynne giving a talk to this foundation, and you can find that if you Google Anthony Wynne Levantine, something like that, you'll find his talk. And then he's got an out-of-print book called Three Camels, which I think is about 100 quid.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah, but but where are are the files still exist?
I don't know, I'm afraid. I'm getting all my information really from Anthony's book and his talk.
I mean, and actually, you raised a great point, Caroline. Are there commercial records that still exist behind the Baker businesses? I mean, we've seen some from the GP&J Baker, but for George's business, are there commercial records that still exist?
I can chime in on that. Unilever took the records over, and before Benz retired, and I'm not sure when he retired, but he was working for them. He was the last of the Istanbul bakers. They tasked him with doing a history of that side of the family, which he did in 1964, or 68. Yeah, 68. And it's a very good history. And he was working from our company archives. Unfortunately, he and Ruby, who was writing hers at the same time, were not talking to each other. And that's a whole nother ball of wax that I won't get into. But had they compared notes, they would have had a much better story. And I've put them both together. So the running away, the going to William George Middleton, all of that is from Victor Binns. And the Arthur Bakers and G.P. Bakers must have known about him because George Baker had a full length of him hanging at Rumley Asar. He commissioned it, he had it shipped out. So they all knew about William George Middleton and how important he was to George, but Ruby and her side of the family never mentioned him.
And his name.
And his name.
Okay.
Doesn't come up.
Yeah, it's tragic. Well, I had a follow-up question. Stratford Canning clearly was influential in helping George and possibly even invested, but I was interested with any records of how much money did Stratford Canning make out of all this? He's probably already a wealthy man, but how much wealthier did he become through George's efforts?
Okay, so the mid-1880s, the French and British were giving out loans with very high interest rates to invest in the Ottoman Empire. And Stratford Canning made the mistake of investing most of his money, and then the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt and he lost it all. And when he died, there was only a couple hundred of pounds left as estate, and Queen Victoria made the unusual move of requesting Parliament to enact, I don't know, a law, whatever was necessary to keep his wife and 3 daughters supported until all 4 of them died.
Okay.
Wow.
So that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
Whereas George Baker, all of his savings and investment were done in England. So he avoided all of that. He was corrupted by it.
Fascinating. Yes, Mark Willingale. You're on mute, Mark.
Just an aside on that point, Gillian, in the southern corner of the consulate grounds in Tarabia, Hanson had a house, Hanson of Hanson Bank. Do you think George actually borrowed money from Hanson?
He did. He absolutely did. It's in his journal.
Oh, right. So Hanson lived on the same gardens.
I know. Yes. And yeah, so when he transferred to Tarapia, he used his profits from the Crimean War and a loan from Hanson to build up stock in the back room of the shop, the first shop,
Right.
Prospect Place. So yes, they were, and Hanson was one of his gardening clients. And when Hanson was kicked out of Tarapia and offered property in Kandili, which he took, and this was by the Sultan, it was George who landscaped his new place in Kandili.
Right. Okay. I mean, the other point, by the way, with the gardens is that the telegraph had only just started, and the Tarabia Gardens is where the telegraph line from the Crimea landed, was then relayed to London, and they were shocked in London that they could literally hear a report of the cannons being fired at Sebastopol. So it was quite a kind of technologically advanced setup at the time that George was arriving around there.
Great.
Indeed.
Thank you, Mark. Any last questions or points from anybody? I've got, Ada. You're on mute, Ada.
Sorry. Thanks. My father's side, my grandparents were carpet producers from Uşak. So I have a question for James. You showed at the beginning of the presentation, you showed a list of goods traded in Turkey, I guess. I couldn't see all the details, but I wanted to know about the date of those records, maybe which archive they're from. And I was specifically wondering about like if they were raw goods or like finished material, like finished carpets or like dyes and cotton stuff that's used for making
I'm going to
textiles.
have to pass over to Gillian. I got that list from Gillian. My understanding is that they were exporting raw materials and importing largely finished materials. But is that correct, Gillian?
Pretty much, yeah. They were importing raw materials too, but as far as the carpets went, the carpets were being produced for them in and around Smyrna and in Persia and in India. So they were buying ready-made carpets, but they were also producing their own and designing their own. And this was a big shift because originally when the bakers got into the carpet business, carpets were solely produced locally and sold locally. But when Europe and England became interested in carpets, then businessmen like George Baker decided, well, we'll take over a factory and start producing our own. And in Turkey, they had help with the La Fontaine's. He was producing carpets for them.
Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you. And yeah, we have La Fontaine's who are members of the LHF. In fact, last question from me, and maybe the last one of the evening as we're running out of time. What were the sort of main other families, in Istanbul with whom the bakers sort of associated or married? Obviously La Fontaine Woods. Anyone else? Any other names?
Yeah, the Pullmans. So Henry Pullman was the architect who was brought out to replace Smith and build the summer residence. I don't see Mark Bertram, but I have a running argument with him as to whether he actually did that or not, design it. We know he didn't build it. So yeah, there were a ton of families that are all over your website, like the Hansons and the Whittals and the La Fontaines and the Barkers.
So we all end up being cousins one way or another, many times removed. So if any cousins are looking to research their own family lines, do use the website. If we can help, answer questions, introduce you to other people that you don't know, we're very glad to do so. I think I should draw it to a close. What a wonderful talk Gillian and James have given us. Thank you so much. And we really look forward to, I think, reading through the material more closely and carefully over the coming months. Thank you both very much. And thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see my Levitt cousins.
Hi, Emily. How are you doing?
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.